passage number 8. So I'm going to get the timer going here. Alrighty. Here we go. So we got ethics, worldviews, judging. Yeah, so definitely. So ethics, probably humanities passage. So I'm looking for some strong opinions here. Let's see. In any case, in order to effectively decide among choices, particularly choices that have obviously social consequences, a worldview, whether documented or not, seems inherent and inevitable. Okay, so what is the thing that the author deems is really important? It is a worldview. Why is it important? It's important when making decisions that have obviously social consequences. In fact, not only is it important, it is inherent and inevitable. So it's bound to happen. Conscious reflection and refinement of a person's ethics seems therefore to be something akin to a reflection and refinement of decision making. Okay. So applications are more compelling. It's a bit of a shift. This process is slow and therefore likely not. Okay, one method. Difficult, but it does not imply. Okay, so looks as though there's a shift in tone here, but there's some nice shifts over here as well. So let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So there's 8 paragraphs here. So we have the outline, 5, 6, 7, 8. And so number 3 is maybe where that first shift in tone is, as well as possibly somewhere in number 7 as well. Alright, let's jump into it. So I'm going to pause and predict the passage again. So the point of the passage, so where we're heading, is to the conclusion that worldviews are really important. So worldviews are really important when it comes to choices with social consequences. All right. So we're looking for what kind of social consequences, what kind of choices are we talking about here? Why are worldviews inherent and inevitable? And yeah, so let's see how the author gets to that point. Imagine that while driving, an oncoming car cuts you off. Our initial thought might be that the other driver is careless, impatient, and altogether rotten, as opposed to perhaps being in a rush to drop off a passenger to the airport. On the contrary, when we cut someone off, it's often a necessary and perfectly acceptable procedure. When judging ourselves, we focus on situational factors, as all first person, like being late to a meeting, and ignore character traits. This tendency for people to overemphasize character traits and underemphasize situational factors when judging other people's behavior while doing the complete opposite for themselves is called the fundamental attribution error, and it is a useful psychological concept when discussing ethics. So this is sort of a contextual sort of portion to introduce ethics. So it explains why we often judge others harshly while rationalizing our own unethical behavior. This is a difficult concept to digest, but it does not imply that we are forever determined to be unethical hypocrites. Okay, so does that sort of tie in here? Unethical hypocrites. So a worldview seems inherent and inevitable. So maybe the inevitability of a worldview means that we're not forever determined to be unethical hypocrites. So through conscious reflection and refinement, something like that. So yeah, I guess it can kind of relate. Alright, so the byproduct, so it simply means that our behaviors, or rather our judgments of our behaviors, need be consciously examined. Yeah, okay. So the byproduct of the conscious pursuit of defining ethical boundaries is a function of a worldview. Here we go, talking about worldviews. Worldviews are essentially subjective but clear interpretations of our realities. One method of constructing this subset of our worldview that focuses on ethical guidelines is situational behavioral analysis. During situational analysis, a person reflects upon situations they experienced. They describe the situation in terms of the environment, blah, 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 proceeding, blah, blah. Okay, they then dissect their own behavior as well as the behavior of others. And using reason and a set of guiding questions, determine an up-to-date interpretation of the events that occurred. Finally, they revisit their own behavior to determine whether or not this is a behavior they would repeat. The reasons for or against the continuation of that analyzed behavior become the basis of that person's individual ethics. Okay, so again, they're just reflecting upon the situation that they go through. They're describing people and things involved, dissect their own behavior and other people's behavior, and then basically revisit their own behavior, see why they would or would not continue their own behavior. So this process is slow and therefore will likely not become widespread unless something more compelling than awareness of the fundamental attribution error comes into attention. Nonetheless, it isn't a far stretch of the imagination to wonder what a society would be like whose members were slower to judge. Applications of worldview are more compelling. Okay, so here we go. So unless something more compelling, so what is that something that's more compelling? Be here. Applications of worldviews are more compelling when you consider decision making. The act of deliberate choice involves the conscious understanding of values that you place upon each choice in your consideration set. The very root of the word decide comes from the Latin de and cedere, which essentially means to cut off. Out of this decision come the values that reside in the individual. Whether or not those values resonate with the individual is the topic of further discussion on worldviews. So again, it's basically this making a worldview is basically just reflecting and refining your own decision-making process, and out of that comes our personal ethics, right? This becomes the basis of our personal ethics, and so just by examining our decision-making, a worldview seems inevitable. So basically, the fact that you make decisions, right, means that you have some values, right? So there are some values. So out of a decision come the values that reside in the individual. So whether you're documenting them or not, you have a worldview. You have a set of criteria, personal individual ethics that that basically determine the outcome of decisions, and that those values need to be consciously examined. It doesn't mean that we're hypocrites and we like the fundamental attribution error, that we're condemned to being sort of unethical hypocrites. It just means that there is something in there that we can extract, and that's about it. Okay. So what is the main idea of the passage? So if left to their own devices, humans will value their own character more highly than that of... So again, it's not about the fundamental attribution error. The usefulness of a worldview becomes apparent when faced with the decisions that have significant ethical ramifications. That is much better. Right? It's because that's like the big shift in tone over here about being more compelling. So, and it's about worldviews. So definitely not A. Situational behavioral analysis is slow and therefore no. So that's not the main idea. The conscious pursuit of defining ethical boundaries leads to the development of a worldview. Ooh, that's tricky. So it seems as though... So this talks about effectively deciding among choices, particularly choices that have obvious social consequences. So it has to do with decision making and social consequences. And social consequences, obviously social consequences being significant ethical ramifications, and why worldviews become useful being pretty obvious when considering decisions that we have to make in those situations. So I say B is stronger. What is the role of the Latin etymology? It is basically, we find it, and so the very root of the word decides. So the act of deliberate choice involves, so we find it here. So the act of deliberate choice involves consciously understanding the values you place in your choice. So out of the decision come the values. So whether or not those values resonate is a different story. So it has to do with it being that our worldviews sort of are already there when we make decisions. So to identify the origins of choice as inherently linguistic construct, no. To support the usage of the word dissect in paragraph 5, that sounds like a stretch. To refer back to the example of the driver cutting you off, no. To support the claim that decisions presuppose a set of individual values, yeah. So every decision you make already presupposes that you have a set of individual values. Whether or not you agree with those values or you've consciously examined those values is a different story. It just means that they're there inherently, which is not an example of fundamental attribution error. So a fundamental attribution error has the combination of you overemphasizing character traits when judging other people and not doing that for yourself. That's the error. Okay. So you interpret a friend who cannot start a fire as too impatient while feeling embarrassed when you cannot do the same task. All right. So that would be an example. It seems as though. In this situation, let's see. So you fail an exam and believe that it was because the testing center was too cold. Yeah, so that's definitely, so this is definitely one. So you interpret a friend as being too impatient, and you feel kind of embarrassed that you cannot do the same task. So you fail an exam and believe it was because the testing center was too cold. So in this situation, it doesn't really include you interpreting anybody else's behaviors, so that's definitely not. I'm running out of time, so I'll just say that. Which of the following would be an example of a compelling reason to use a worldview? Has to do with decision making with obviously social consequences. So judging whether or not a person was clumsy, that's not really a social consequence. Determining the direction to take after college, that's definitely more socially consequential. Formulating your opinions on the actions of a character in a movie, that's sort of not very that socially consequential. Contemplating how to best act during a first date. Yeah, I would say that the direction to take after college is a bit more compelling in terms of obviously social consequences. What does the process of situational behavioral analysis entail? Gathering feedback about your behavior from loved ones? No. Deciding in hindsight the appropriateness of their own behavior? Yes. Yes. So documenting the motivations for the behavior of other parties involved? No. So you're not really understanding the motivations of other people, you're understanding your own motivations. So I'd say it's just 2. Okay. Alright, definitely a really difficult passage. I'm not going to lie about that. So let's kind of break down and see what we can do here to face this sort of ethics passage. And these are difficult passages in terms of being humanities, being more philosophical, more subjective, and difficult to understand a lot of times. But again, just sticking to the process, trying to ground ourselves in these methodologies will help us along the way. Number one being that there is something that the author deems as very, very important as compared to something else. So over here we said that, you know, what's important is the worldview, and it's definitely important when you're deciding among choices that have obviously social consequences. And that is that a worldview is inevitable, right? So that's super important in these situations. It gives some context, obviously, about, you know, why ethics or you know, sort of like a red herring, basically, about how we tend to be unethical hypocrites in these situations, and that was sort of just sort of providing a context in which maybe the worldview might be important, and it doesn't seem as though. So the author says that this is a good way to kind of examine our judgments of our behaviors and so on and so forth. That's basically all this is for. But later on, because I'm still looking for that hierarchy of what's more important than something else, and that hierarchy only really comes in when it comes down to here, right? So I think that this is probably the first time, and this is probably the second time. So the first time it says that we're not forever determined to be unethical hypocrites. It just means that we need to analyze our judgments of our behaviors. So we know that a worldview is a useful tool which it helps us examine our ethical boundaries, right? And that's all this is basically established, is that, hey, a worldview helps us examine our ethical boundaries, and that's about it. But in terms of like an argument, it still seems kind of straightforward, like a social science passage. But because it's a passage about ethics and philosophy, there's usually, like I said, that hierarchy. So it's really just about this point over here, where the author says that because all this stuff is slow and kind of procedural and inward, it's most likely, therefore, will not become widespread unless something more compelling than the fundamental attribution error comes into people's attention, right? And so then the author goes in to say the applications of worldview are more compelling when you consider decision making, specifically when it comes to, as we see later on, that have obviously social consequences. So really the hierarchy has to do with the author's opinion of what will best make worldviews more widespread. And it has to do with the idea that considering decision making where a worldview is inherent and inevitable, because you have to have a set of values or ethical boundaries that determine your decisions. Whether or not you agree with those decisions is a different topic. It's just about, hey, decision making is a way to hook people into understanding worldviews and their importance, and therefore when it comes to the main point that the author's trying to make, it has to do with that being a good hook to kind of get people into the understanding of why worldviews are important. So that's the hierarchy, using decision making as a hook when it comes to social consequences, as opposed to these sort of fundamental attribution error that doesn't really have to do with conscious decision making. So yeah, definitely a subtle hierarchy there, but definitely there is one. So we look at the main idea of this problem over here. We have a foundations of comprehension problem. Number 2 is reasoning within the text. Number 3 is, which is not an example of fundamental. So that's again reasoning beyond the text. Which of the following would be an example of compelling reason? This would be foundations of comprehension. And what does the process look like? That is foundation of comprehension as well. So again, a difficult passage, because not only is the main idea pretty complicated and subtle to understand and extract, the 3 out of 5 of the problems are based upon the foundations of comprehension, which requires you to understand the point of the passage. So it's a double whammy there. And if we were to kind of see, let's break them down. Let's kind of see what we can glean from these problems here. So foundations of comprehension. So what is the main idea? Again, the main idea here. So we know it's an ethical passage. We know it's humanities, and we know that we're looking for a hierarchy here. And we start off in the concluding sentence. So we know that, again, this is important, and it's important when it comes to decisions that have to do with, obviously, social consequences, right? So that right away is something that we can be secure of. Okay? Now, the idea of that being obvious and more compelling, that's where this portion comes in, right? So a worldview is useful. The worldview is useful when faced with decisions that have significant ethical ramifications. That you can definitely get from this sort of concluding sentence. But the idea that the author is trying to say, hey, I'm trying to explain why worldviews are obviously important. Like, I'm trying to hook people in. What would make it more aware of the usefulness? That's where this phrase here is difficult to capture. So you would have captured that when it comes to this hierarchy over here, where the shift in tone begins in this 6th paragraph and ends in this 7th paragraph here. Right? So there was another passage that we had experienced a similar thing where the shift setup had begun, but we didn't have that sort of resolution until a different paragraph. There was a break in between where they kind of included like a little tangent, right? But this idea of worldviews being more widespread and becoming more aware in society, that was over here in the beginning, the first part of the shift in tone, and then it ended in the beginning of the 7th paragraph saying applications of worldview are more compelling when you consider decision making. So that split is what really makes this hierarchy kind of complicated. And again, because you've seen this example before in other passages, you should make a note of that this is a possibility. So this would be on the harder side of the WMC MCAT, but it is a situation that will occur. So the combination of this split shift in tone plus the concluding sentence here, the conclusion thesis, is really makes up the main idea here, right? And so that subtle shift in tone, so we had seen a couple of shifts in tone beforehand, here and here, right? But if you examine these shifts in tone a bit more intently, it doesn't really show some sort of a hierarchy. So this one says it does not imply that we are forever determined to be unethical hypocrites. Again, I had to stretch and rationalize how that connected to the concluding sentence where it talks about worldviews being effective in decision making, right? Like that doesn't really connect very much. So I was like, well, maybe it does. And then we had the second shift in tone here where it introduces the worldview finally. And it said that worldviews are essentially subjective but clear interpretations of our realities. That's not really a shift in tone comparing two different claims. It's just saying that it's both subjective, but it's also clear, right? That's not really opposing any arguments. The author agrees that it's subjective, and the author agrees that it's clear. So neither of these shifts in tones are really the main sort of indicators of the thesis of the passage. It isn't until, like I said, you get to the split shift in tone here that you really begin to get into the meat of the argument. So it's one of those passages where basically the first 3 paragraphs, first 4 paragraphs are just basically context, right? Even the 5th paragraph, it introduces the concept of a worldview briefly here. Before that, it just talks about some introduction to ethics and something catchy. But this 5th paragraph is again sort of a bit more context about what situational analysis is. So really, it's difficult because there's a lot of fluff. And so as you're interpreting, as you're reading through this passage, and you have your highlighter and you're highlighting these various setups for shifts and tones as well, then you'll start to see and get a little bit more used to the fact that, like, does this connect to the thesis, which talks about worldviews and decision making? If it doesn't really do that, as clearly as something else, and if it doesn't really, capture that hierarchy, then perhaps this is one of those passages where there's a bit more of a split, and so you might want to sort of wait until later on down the passage as you get closer to the conclusion to see how it all connects together. All right. So second problem talks about the role of etymology. Again, you just look for where that thing is. The Latin was over here, and you just look at the context clues. So the act of deliberate choice involves conscious understanding of values. Out of this decision come the values that reside in the individual. And so the idea that values reside in an individual when you're making conscious when you're making decisions, that's sort of the point. So it's just supporting that claim that there are values that are inside an individual that presuppose the decisions that are made. And luckily the other answer choices were a little bit more difficult, or were a little bit more obviously not the right answer, because they all kind of had a lot of rationalization, a lot of sort of weird, sort of disconnected points. So luckily D was way more supported than the other ones, because it did talk about decision making. It talked about having those sets of individual values. None of the other three talked about those. Which is not an example of fundamental attribution error. Again, whether or not you know what fundamental attribution error is beside the point. We're going across based upon what the passage talked about. So the passage defines the fundamental attribution error as tendency for people to overemphasize character traits when judging other people while doing the complete opposite for themselves. That sort of 1-2 punch is how the author defines fundamental attribution error. So if you don't have that 1-2 punch, that's going to be the least correlated to it as an example. So this only has, you blaming the testing center being too cold. That's more, if you remember from behavioral science, that's more external locus of control, right? But it doesn't have any other sort of that 1-2. It doesn't have the other component of fundamental attribution error, which says, somebody you see somebody else fail the exam and you believe because they didn't study hard enough, right? If it included both of those two things, then it would be fundamental attribution error. And all the other choices there, it did. So you interpret a friend who cannot start a fire, being too impatient, while feeling embarrassed when you cannot do the same task, right? So it has to do with the sort of interpretation of the friend as opposed to you. You witness a coffee shop patron in front of you spill a hot cup of coffee, think that maybe they're too clumsy. When you spill it, you almost spill it, you think it's because of the high temperature of the cup. So that's definitely fundamental attribution error. You watch the movers struggle to lift a washing machine into a new apartment and perceive them as lacking dexterity, yet when you enter to help them, you blame the corridor being too narrow. So that's quite obviously not the case. So between A and B, A is again pretty difficult. But I would say that that as it relates to what's the definition in the passage, having that both of those components in there, B is much weaker than A in that regard. Again, tough problem. Which of the following would be an example of a compelling reason to use a worldview? So compelling reason being in quotation marks. So compelling reason, that's basically, again, the point of the passage, that a more compelling reason would have to be when you're considering decision making, especially when it comes to the idea of social consequences. So we're looking for decision making of social consequences. So determining is, again, a nice sort of synonym for decision making, but let's see. So judging whether a person was clumsy, right? So this is the fundamental attribution error. So that's not an example of compelling reason, right? So because the author says we need something more compelling than the fundamental attribution error when it comes to invoking the sense of importance of a worldview. So this is not really going to be very strong, especially compared to B, which says determining the direction to take after college for a career. Careers are very obviously big social consequences. So A is crossed off. B versus C. C says formulating your opinion on the actions of a major character in a movie. Again, movie versus a career in terms of obviously social consequences when it comes to decision making, right? That's not very strong. So B versus D. Contemplating how to best act during your first date. This relates more to that situational analysis, which again is kind of pretty slow. It's too slow and therefore not going to be widespread. So it's not really about a compelling reason. So contemplating how to best act during a first date. First date being a bit social, I get it, but in terms of sort of ethical, social, major social or ethical consequences, the choice of what direction you'll take after college would be a bit more of a major life decision, ethical decision, as compared to contemplating how to best act during a first date, which doesn't really have that much of an effect besides you and the person that you're involved with, as opposed to a career and the and the way that you'll be affecting the economy and the society or whatever the case may be. So B would be a bit more in line with the idea of making decisions of obviously things with obviously social consequences. So what does the process of situational behavioral analysis entail? So gathering feedback about your behavior from loved ones. So there is no real point. It's a very individual, self-reflective process, right? A person reflects upon the situation they experienced. So it doesn't really have to do with gathering feedback from other people. You're just describing the situation. Where were you? Who was involved? What happened before? What happened after? Dissecting your own behavior, dissecting other people's behavior, using reason and instead of guiding questions to determine an up-to-date interpretation of the events that occurred, and then finally revisiting their own behavior to determine whether or not this is a behavior that they would repeat. So deciding in hindsight the appropriateness for their own behavior, that's definitely the conclusion. So 2 is good, 1 is not good. And then number 3 is basically 3 is basically not an option in these answer choices, along with 2, right? So if we know 1 is gone, then that allows you to cross off A, B, and D. But if you look at 3, documenting the motivations for their behavior or for the behavior of other parties involved, it doesn't really say necessarily that you're documenting the motivations for the behavior. It just says that you are dissecting the behavior of others and yourself. And so, it's a little bit vague, but in terms of being able to understand the motivations, I'm not sure if that's within the scope of this analysis, because it would be kind of difficult to be able to understand the motivations of other people without and documenting them without really being able to talk to them, especially if it's a self-reflective process, and you won't really be able to talk to the party involved to understand what their motivations were. Okay, so 2 is the one that really makes sense in the context of the passage. Now, boy, was that a difficult passage? Yes, absolutely. But hopefully you gathered some insights from this breakdown. And if you did have some more questions, concerns, I'm definitely open to hearing any of them. Post some of them on Reddit, and me or the rest of the community will chime in. Keep on studying those processes, and again, pay attention when it comes to being able to have the skill of zooming out and holding this end conclusion of where the author's heading at all times. That's why it's so crucial to hold it at the beginning, because when you hold it at the beginning, it allows you to fight the urge to hold on to every single detail that you read, because if it doesn't have anything to do with the worldviews and decision making and having that being a compelling reason or hierarchies, then chances are it's just a bunch of wordy context. Alright guys, I'll see you in the next passage.